It's not politically correct to allude to this, but I think that the implication in a lot of books and movies is that we modern people are darned lucky that the Spaniards got here when they did, got rid of the Aztecs, so that we, the people living today, wouldn't have to deal with this culture that is somehow or was somehow beyond the pale of humanity. So most people do think that the Aztecs and their culture are long gone. But that is not actually the case. There are still over 1 million speakers of Nahuatl, the Aztec language, in Mexico today. And there are some living in cities in the United States who have come here as migrants. The majority of people in Mexico are descended from either the Aztecs or some other indigenous people and feel very close to them in some way. Right? Now, you can probably tell, just from taking one look at me, that I am not one of those descendants. I was born in New York City, grew up in this area, and then in my 20s, I went to live in Central America. It was a formative experience. I came back and got my PhD, and today I teach history, both US history and Latin American history. Well, a number of years ago, I decided that I would write a biography of Malinche, Doña Marina, the indigenous woman who translated Fernando Cortés, who was the Spaniard who came to conquer the Aztecs. I decided that I would take a summer course in her language, even though I knew that as far as we knew, there were no letters or diaries left by this woman. But I thought, if I were writing about Joan of Arc, I wouldn't think that I could do it if I had never learned a word of French, right? So I went to take this class. And I have to confess to you, I think that unbeknownst to me, myself, and I was harboring a bit of racism. I don't mean that I thought the language would be ugly or horrible or anything like that. I thought that I would give it the old college try and I would find out that this language, these people were so different from anything or anyone that I had ever come in contact with that I would have no choice but to just give up. But I would have done my best to try. Well, that turned out to be ridiculous. As any linguist can tell us, we humans, we structure our languages in some very comparable ways. We all have nouns and verbs, subjects and predicates. I'm pretty good at languages, and I should have known that I could do it, that this was another language coming from just another group of people. The even bigger surprise, though, was that the teachers in this course were showing us documents that the Nahuas, the speakers of Nahuatl, had written in the 1500s. And I could not find in them anywhere any evidence of these heart-eating, eye-gouging, horrific people that I was supposed to be finding in the documents. So this was kind of a mystery that I wanted to get to the bottom of. I looked around and realized that the sources of these ideas that we have about the Aztecs come from two places. On the one hand, archaeological remains, and on the other hand, writings left to us by the Spaniards who conquered them. Now, archaeologists, understandably, do not want to spend too much time digging in the sort of the garbage pits of humanity. They want to find big, dramatic monuments, extraordinary buildings. So most of the archaeologists in Mexico have spent their time digging out the pyramid temples. And at the heart of the pyramid temple religion was an occasional human sacrifice. So they really did find things like this skull rack that you're looking at. Right? They didn't know what to make of these because you can't hear the archaeological remains talking. We don't know how often did this happen? How many people did it happen to? What did the other people in the culture who weren't priests think about it? They didn't know any of these answers. So they went and read whatever the Spaniards in the 1500s had written down. And I think you will not be surprised to learn that the Spaniards were very invested in painting these people as the world's worst villains because they had conquered them. They wanted the world to believe that they needed to be conquered, that the Spaniards had done a good thing in conquering them. What surprised me more when I thought about it was that the stereotype had lasted for so long. 500 years is a long time for a bad reputation to last. Okay? But it occurred to me, looking at all the ways in which this idea surfaces, that it's been extremely useful in the United States to have an enemy of that kind. Horrible, vicious people who live just to the south of us, right? It has come up over and over again In the 1800s, in the Mexican-American War, the war when our government used a sort of an excuse to make war against Mexico so that we could take the northern third of their territory and turn it into our American Southwest and California. In that war, they actually distributed copies of the book you see in front of you, The History of the Conquest of Mexico. Now, the book was about the conquest of the Aztecs. It wasn't about the war that was going on then in the 1800s. But the author actually said it was the providence, or the will of divine providence, that one race replace another. So the soldiers could read this and feel that they were still part of this great course of history in which sort of the dastardly deeds of one group of people would be put aside forever because more virtuous and greater people would take their place. We know they thought this because they actually left comments like that in their diaries. Even in very recent times, I was reading a book about the drug wars at the border between the US and Mexico, and the journalist who was writing the book, who was a very smart guy, very good writer, made a lot of good points, he began each chapter with a quick paragraph coming from descriptions of the sacrifices that purportedly took place in the 1500s. As if there was some sort of a straight line between what happened in the 1400s in Mexico and what the drug lords were doing today. That straight line, I guess, would be the evil nature of the Mexican character. It was something that he was using to shore up his argument about why this was happening. It was a convenience for him to have this belief out there. Or even more recently, we all remember when Donald Trump announced his candidacy in 2016 by saying we must stop the Mexicans. They are rapists, they are criminals. He was speaking about the most law-abiding group of people in the United States, the agricultural workers. But more than half of the country took this very seriously because they had, I would argue, internalized this belief that the people down there are more violent and more depraved than other people. Right? I think we would all agree that in order to really know people, we must hear them speaking. I'm not the first one to think of that, and other scholars in the past have asked themselves, well, how can we hear what the Aztecs had to say? But what they ended up doing was turning to what I'll call interviews that Spanish friars and Spanish court officials had done. So in the case of this drawing, for example, a Spanish priest asked a local guy, isn't it true that your people used to believe that you had to feed hearts to the gods and you would cruelly, in a dreadful way, cut their still living hearts out from their bodies and throw them down the pyramid? And the Nahuatl-speaking man would say, yes, indeed, sir, that is what our God used to tell us to do, that is what we did. And in reading sources like this, we learn a lot about the pressures that one culture can put on another. We learn a lot about how disempowered people feel that they have to please the person who's talking to them. We can learn a lot. But it's not what we would learn if we were listening to the Aztecs as they talked privately amongst themselves. I thought what we need are sources that were written and created outside of the radar screen of the Spaniards, that the Spaniards knew nothing about and were not part of making or controlling. And there are sources like that. They had something called the Xipohuali. This had existed for generations. They would, on an animal skin or a long piece of cactus paper, put glyphs like you see in front of you, and then other glyphs coming off of them. Glyphs are these little images that they use to remind themselves what to say. So an historian would stand there with a piece of paper and say, this is the year in which such and such happened, and this is the year in which such and such happened. It would speak for hours and tell the people about their history, and then other young people would be inspired and grow up to become history tellers themselves. Okay? Well, in a great irony, the Spanish conquest that caused so many problems for the indigenous people also helped to preserve these tellings of history, because young people, college-aged people actually, went home to their grandfathers and their mothers and said, tell us the history, tell us the prayers that you used to tell. So you can imagine, looking at these words in front of you, that some old man would say to his grandson, "Nika ni panshiwit," and he'd begin to talk. And the young person would take the Roman alphabet that he had learned from the friars and use it to sound out what he had just heard. He was learning to speak Spanish, so for him to spell out Nican would be N-I-C-A-N, Ipan, Y-P-A-N, Nican Ipan Shiwit. And what that means is here in this year, a war broke out. They could go on to say anything they wanted. So we actually have thousands of pages that look like this, that have some glyphs and a lot of writing, and many, many more pages that have just the writing, forget the glyphs, okay? Sentence after sentence, paragraph after paragraph, full of rich material that these people said and thought, things they laughed about, things they didn't like, things they liked, okay? All sorts. Okay? Much of what you find in these sources, if they date from, say, if they're about the 20 to 30 years right before the conquest, tell us about the specifics of the history, okay? What happened, what ruler did what war they made. But some of them tell stories that date from a much earlier period, okay? They are what you might call legends or myth histories. And just to give you a sense of it, I'm going to read you one paragraph. This is the story of Corn Tassel Gem, a noblewoman from Cuernavaca whose hand was sought in marriage by the ruler of the Aztecs when the Aztecs were still very poor. King Huitzilihuitl sent messengers to Cuernavaca to ask for her hand as wife, and Lord Ozomatzin heard the words by which the Aztecs asked for his daughter. But Ozomatzin just went up to the marriage brokers and he said, "What is Huitzilihuitl saying? What will he give my daughter there on his island? Perhaps he will clothe her in the thread of marsh plants, just as he makes his own loincloths out of marsh plants? And what will he give her to eat? Go, tell your ruler, Huitzilihuitl, tell him once and for all, you are not to come here again." Well, as you may guess, the story turns into a love story. The king successfully courts the girl, and though the girl sometimes feels that she's been duped or her people partially conquered as she goes off to what is now Mexico City, she ends up having the last word because it is her son who rules all of the Aztecs in the next generation. So it's a political parallel about the complexities of power negotiation. I can say that these sources have been a revelation to me. The people in them are real. They laugh, they talk, they argue. The payoff has been enormous. Now, I will say, I've got to be honest, the Aztecs did practice human sacrifice. Archaeologists have told us that on every continent in the world, except Antarctica, of course, there is evidence of human sacrifice in very ancient days. The Native Americans were no exception. What the Aztecs did towards the end of their reign in order to get more power, in order to rule over more people, was turn that human sacrifice into a terror tactic. They weaponized religion. Okay? So by the end of their realm, at the end of their 100 years of power, they were using it in brutal ways. It doesn't mean that they actually all believed that they needed to sacrifice another human heart in order to make the sun rise. It was a political tactic, and in fact, this appears in one of the histories that I've read. One old man told his interlocutor, well, we used to go out to the places that we were interested in conquering, grab a couple of people, bring them back to watch the worst of the sacrifice ceremonies, and then let them go. We wanted them to run home to tell their people that it would not be wise to fight against joining the empire. It was too dangerous. Too many of their people might get pulled into the horrible human sacrifice. It would be better to voluntarily join the empire. He summarized it by saying, in this way, they were undone. Okay? So it was a political power play, as we have seen very powerful governments in different times and places make as well. The most remarkable thing, I think, is thinking about what we have chosen to believe over all these years. How could we have believed what we did believe? That is, how could we have convinced ourselves that a whole culture of people were dedicated to a cult of death, invested in the most hideous practice imaginable? Not how could we believe that a few people would do that, the priests, the leading governing figures, but how could we have convinced ourselves that the vast majority of them were like that, and that this was not like other peoples near them, that they were uniquely horrific in this way? It makes no sense. Okay? it isn't just an academic point. I mean, I am an academic, I want to get it right, but it matters today. It certainly matters to modern Indigenous people to be able to set down the burden of having had ancestors that were supposed to be uniquely horrific, hateful, vicious, more cruel than any others. They need to be able to let that go. But I would argue that it matters to all of us, those of us who are not Indigenous as well. We learn a lot when we realize we have believed something about another group of people that doesn't really make sense unless we believe that they're not really human. And if we figure out that we have believed that, then haven't we learned something pretty important about ourselves? Thank you. Okay, great.